Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to teissTalks. We are live every Thursday morning at 10, every Tuesday afternoon at 4. So please stick us in your diary, make us your appointment to view. You can watch us on catch up, of course, but where would be the fun in that? Good morning to everybody. It is Data Privacy Day. Woo! And what better day to discuss GDPR, how it's bedded in over the last few years, where it is going next in our post-Brexit world, and what we can glean from the various activities of the various regulators across Europe. We have a fantastic panel with us to discuss this today. We have from Privacy Culture, Steve Wright, who's the Chief Executive. From Police Crime Prevention Initiatives, we have Simon Newman. They're both going to be joining us later. For the moment, our lead guest on this, I'm delighted to welcome Glenn Heimers, who is the Global CISO and Head of Data Protection at Save the Children, who's going to be chatting with me about this. Glenn, welcome.
Good morning, Jeff. How are you?
I'm all right, thank you. Just first of all, before we get onto this topic, I noticed digging into your CV, you are, am I right in saying you're a Duke of Edinburgh's Award assessor? Is that right?
I am. It's one of the things I do in my spare time, what little spare time I have.
You must have seen many damp, unhappy children under canvas in your time.
Many damp, unhappy and lost children, and spent many an hour running across lots of hills really quickly to try and find them when they're not where they're meant to be.
So you have to go, and if they're not at the point, you've got to go and find them, track them down.
Yeah, so there's a couple of aspects to it. There's the assessor aspect, which is the bit that you just mentioned about there, but there's also the supervisory capacity as well. So, and if they're not where they're meant to be and you're there as the supervisor, you got to go find them. So my most endearing, happy memory around that was running across the peaks, across the top of the peaks in the height of summer with a massive backpack on my back, sweating to death, trying to find 12 kids that you managed to find themselves on the other side of the range rather than on the bit that they were meant to be on.
And I'm guessing when you found them, they were all on their phones going, oh God, we were fine. Why are you worried?
Yeah, pretty much. We knew where we were. Well, where do you think you are then? Well, we think we're here. Well, you're not. You're here. So yeah,
you are former RAF police as well, so imagine you're quite a hard taskmaster.
Yeah, so I say former. So I'm a reservist now, but yeah, I'm a former regular. But yes, I am quite a hard taskmaster. I'm not particularly. What's the word I'm looking for? Forgiving. I will give advice and guidance in a rather blunt and predominantly good way, but it's all from a good place. It's all from a good place. Character build.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, cool to be kind, as it were. Yeah.
Exactly.
Good stuff. And listen, by the way, people watching, if you've got questions during this session, please ask them. Otherwise, I just wang on with my own questions, and let's face it, who wants to hear about that? So please use the question panel, use the chat panel, and we will actually try and use the questions one rather than the chat one, and we'll throw questions in both for Glenn and for Steve and Simon later on. Glenn, you're now at Save the Children,
yes.
Which follows up on a lot of the work that you've done. And I mean, talking about GDPR, data protection, that kind of thing, that is this very sensitive data, presumably, that Save the Children's got. You're steeped in this kind of work, presumably.
Yeah, so Save the Children, we're collecting pretty much every single aspect of data you could ever think of. At my previous place at the Prince's Trust, we were doing something very similar. So when I was the CISO at the Prince's Trust, we did exactly the same thing. So embedding data protection as a culture is really, really, really important because we are helping young people in times of absolute horrendous circumstances for Save the Children specifically in this area here. I mean, things like the responses in Syria and all those, and the humanitarian crises like Haiti, etc. It's important that we maintain that protection, because without that, there's no trust, and if there's no trust, we can't help. And that's predominantly the view and the aspect I take on that.
Yeah. For you guys then, so GDPR was sort of builds this kind of mighty, terrifying juggernaut coming down like, on the ground, particularly, for Save the Children. Was it a huge wave that crashed over you, or actually was it incremental change? How did it work out?
So I can't comment on when it came out. I wasn't at Save, so I've only been at Save just over a year now. But when I was at the Prince's Trust, which is a very similar organisation in his mission in the youth, and for us it was more an incremental at Prince's Trust. And from what I can see of what we're doing at Save, it's very similar. So it wasn't this massive bow wave of change, because, like you said, if you were doing data protection properly in the first place, it was basically looking at what you were doing then and how would you make sure you're covering off the points in the GDPR. So it was it's been more incremental, and Elizabeth Dunham said it quite a lot in the build up to this. It wasn't a massive game changer. It was an improvement on the rules, an improvement in the way the regulation was done. So that's how we've tackled it. We've tackled it as an incremental step by step, and it's a project. It's not the come the 25th of May 2018, bang, everybody was GDPR compliant. You can't be.
No.
It's because things change.
Yeah. Talking of this sense, so I mean, one of the big things that's got the attention, of course, is the fines. And I want to just quickly chat about Grindr, which for those unacquainted with, it's a gay dating app. When I was at Channel 4 News, the correspondent I worked with was sort of obsessed with stories about Grindr, always wanting to do stories about Grindr. And actually, in fairness, if you think about Tinder and what's happened with Tinder and how that's changed the dating scene, you know, Grindr was the sort of original location-based dating app. So maybe he was right, maybe he was onto something. But to fill people in, Grindr have been I think threatened, issued with a fine, although we'll come on to discuss this. Norwegian Data Protection Authority has fined them 10 million euros for data loss. And of course, because Grindr is sitting on, you know, like say, if you talked about the sensitivity of the data, obviously Grindr is sitting on some very sensitive data because homosexuality is illegal in some countries. Yeah. And so this, you know, is a huge issue. But I mean, firstly, this fine, the 10 million euros, what do we think is going to happen with that based on what we've seen before?
It won't be 10 million. It's the easy answer to that. There'll be a massive toing and fro between Norway's data regulator and Grindr. All you've got to do is look at the BA fine as a comparison factor. The ICO issued a huge fine, and that fine has been talked down. It's
not just talked down, it's 183 million was the initial, which Rory Kethland-Jones of the BBC made a great comment. So when it first came through, he thought the decimal point was in the wrong place.
I remember hearing that,
But now it's 20 million. How have they got, have you got an insight into the horse trading that goes on around?
No, but to and fro, it'll be like, well, we can't afford that. You know, we can't afford that. If we give you that, it'll bankrupt us. We'll collapse. We won't be. And this was always going to be the thing with the 4% global turnover. The 4% of global turnover is that big thing of you are going to pay this, and it is a huge finger. I mean, let's take my organisation. If we had to pay 4% of our global turnover, we'd collapse. It would completely wipe out our reserve. Most charities would. It would wipe out your reserve that you've got. So there's a lot of that I would imagine there'll be a lot of that toing and froing and backwards and forwards. And then there's other aspects into it. So, for example, I would imagine, and this is obviously all the world according to Glenn, but if BA or Grindr then offer up something like a data protection type monitoring service, all those kind of things, and if they offer all of those up, so which in themselves, all you've got to do is the fact that the ICO have just recently fined Experian, not very helpful when it's those organisations themselves that do the data protection monitoring services. But you get my point. There's other things going on there, and then the other thing, an organisation like Grindr or BA are going to have to be wary about going forward. I don't know what the class action. I can't talk too much as the class action environment in Norway, but you just got to look what's happening here in the UK. The class action environment that's sprung up after Morrison's and now BA. I mean, it was only a couple of days ago. I was having my breakfast, and an advert came on the TV between the news, which said, "Were you in the BA thing? Contact us. We'll be part of the class action." So that's the environment that we're coming to. Because at the end of the day, if you look at the regulation, it just says you can claim for mental anguish. How do you prove mental anguish? It's like saying I've got a bad back. How do you prove that?
Yeah, but as soon as this came in, the sort of ambulance chasing, not to miscast lawyers as ambulance chasing, but there was a group of very aggressive, legal firms who will go after this stuff. And as soon as it came out, you could claim for things like mental anguish.
Of course, and it's tied in quite nicely with the end of PPI. So all of these PPI type lawyers have got nothing that they can run around after now. So they're going to start looking at the data protection space, and it's already started. So we'll see how that functions and the way that develops. But it's an interesting area for businesses and organisations to think about.
Certainly is. I should just put, for Grindr's point of view, Grindr have said, look, that we have best in class sort of data protection, and they also say that, look, what Norway's talking about, the Norwegian data protection regulator, was not their current practice. They've changed practices, and presumably that will feed into that negotiation around, well, actually, I'll find 10 million because we changed. Yeah,
exactly. I mean, it's look at the Facebook. Facebook were very lucky to get away with the 450,000-500,000 pounds that they got fined because they fell out out with the GDPR requirement.
Yeah,
but I think a statement would have been made. There's a lot of these that are statements to be made by some of the regulators. So the BA thing, for example, the ICO was one of the first that they'd issued under GDPR. So they were flexing their muscles to see what they could get away with, I think. And I haven't really seen anything big come out of the Norway space. So I think potentially there's something there about that as well. It's that flexing of muscles and things like Marriott and stuff.
I remember the TalkTalk one being quite interesting. Again, pre GDPR. So TalkTalk was fine. The headline was 400,000.
Yeah.
I think I'm right in saying they end up paying something like 380,000 because they got a £20,000 discount
for paying on time or whatever. Yeah.
But you look at that era. Okay, 400,000 goes down to 380,000. You look at this era, and the ICO comes out with a £183 million headline figure for BA, which ends up at 20 million. I mean, the discounts. Are we in a situation where firms are negotiating discounts and heavy discounts? That seems to be where we're at now.
I think there's potential for that, but I think the other thing with the BA one, for example, is that the ICO didn't quite understand the power that comes with issuing a fine of that size. It's all well and good saying, there we are, you can have £183 million fine, but what's the capacity of BA to pay that 183 million? Because what's tied up, what's the liquidity like? Yes, there's regulatory. You will put money aside for regulatory issues, but and at the moment in the UK, exactly, yeah. And at the moment in the UK, you can't insure against regulatory fines. The state's different. So in the States, you can. So in the US, if you are issued a fine by the regulators over there, you can actually insure against that in certain cases. But here in the UK, you can't. So that's an interesting dichotomy, especially when you start talking about things like cyber insurance and how does that work. And the whole furore at the moment that's come out from Kieran Martin, who I can see his point, which is that insurance companies are funding the ransomware thing by paying out on those things, which then in turn is with regards to data protection is a big thing. The single biggest threat is the likelihood. I mean, look at Blackboard last year. So when the Blackboard hack happened, they sat on that for months because they didn't want to tell anybody, because the reputational damage would have been huge. The regulatory problem that comes out of it. So that, I think that's probably going to be one of the next big things that the ICO will fine against, will be the Blackboard breach, because that affected so many academic institutions in the UK and so many charities, because Razor's Edge, in inverted commas, as it's known, is one of the single biggest CRMs in that space for alumni and for beneficiaries and donors. So that's going to be interesting to see what happens with that.
Yeah, but it's interesting. There's this time, the time lag before you sort of report a breach. Doesn't that feed into how hard the ICO and other regulators are going to hit you? If you sat on it.
If you do it, if you report within the 72 hours, they'll go, all right, fine, let's do this properly. But if you sit on it, and you sit on it for a long period of time, they're going to go, well, you try to hide that. But the only reason, I mean, a suspicious man like me, I'm an ex-copper. The only reason you've sat on that is because you don't want anyone to know about it, and you have. The only reason you come to speak to us now as a regulator is because someone else has found out about this, and it's going to be public before you make it public. So there's a bit of that there, isn't there? As a regulator, I'd be like that. So why didn't you tell us 6 months ago that you had this breach, when we would have worked with you to come to a conclusion? I mean, at the end of the day, the regulator's there to regulate, yes, but they're there to assist as well. I mean, I've worked with them quite closely on lots of things, and they're very helpful. If you go to them with the questions early on, they're very helpful. They're not there to hit you with a big stick.
But this, I found this interesting, actually, when all this legislation was coming in, because obviously when you find out about what's happened, then you're on the hook. The clock is ticking for that 72 hours. But to play devil's advocate, if you never find out about it in the first place, there's a lot of sense of will companies actually roll back on their monitoring
but then there's the whole thing there around security by design and privacy by design. So if you're not monitoring your environment, you obviously haven't put security by design and privacy by design in. So if you are breached, then there's the issue there, right there. That is a fundamental clause. I mean, don't get me wrong, the GDPR is very vague. It says thou shalt do it. It doesn't tell you how to do it nicely, but it says you should do it. So, and these are the things, those building blocks that will then build in a regulator's mind about what's the actual threat, the existential threat to the data subject, because this is effectively what we're talking about here. It's not you as a business, it's what's the threat to you and I as a data subject of an organization. And what's the impact on us?
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. And actually, usefully, I mean, Simon Newman from Police Crime Prevention Initiatives, which I seem to have trouble remembering the order of those words, is going to be joining us. So he's a perfect person to chat about that. He'll be joining us later in our panel section. We've had a question actually, Glenn, which I wouldn't mind addressing, which come in from Neil King. I think it's an interesting one. A lot of really sensitive information is held by organisations that have limited funds and volunteers. Save. How do you think they will manage as the class action culture grows, as it will often be the really vulnerable that are most impacted by these breaches?
Yeah. So I think there's a couple of ways that this may go. It could be a potential that instead of collecting actual specific information around subjects, data subjects, we start that track to anonymization. A lot of organizations, especially the smaller ones, really need to look at how and what and why they're collecting their data. And I think we went through a very, very long and torturous process at Prince's Trust, and we've gone through a very similar long and torturous process at Save the Children around what is it that we're collecting? Why is it we're collecting it? If we're just using it for statistics, do we need to tie that back to a natural living person? Because if you don't need to tie it back to a natural living person, why collect the personal details in the first place? If all you want to know is how many people you've helped, then don't collect their personal details. Just collect that you've helped them, what their religion is, or whatever it is that statistic purposes that you need. And I think there's an element of to that. But to the question, I think a lot of organisations are going to have to do some deep dark searching about what it is that they're actually collecting and how they're collecting it, it's going with best of breed in inverted commas to try and secure it as best you can, but knowing that there's no one silver bullet or panacea which is going to help with that, because at the end of the day, we've got to be lucky all of the time. They've only got to be lucky once.
Yeah. It's interesting. Sean John, who I think is at Microsoft, talks about Marie Kondoing your data. Decluttering your data, and
it's exactly.
It is this thing. Yeah. Sorry, carry on, Glenn.
No, I was going to say it's exactly that. I've not heard that phrase, and I'm going to steal that quite nicely. Thank you. But yeah, you've got to we Marie Kondoed all of our clothes in our house, and we fold it all the way that Marie Kondo tells you to fold it, so it's all nice and compact. But you're right, it is Marie Kondoing your data, knowing what data you've got, where it's stored, how it's stored, is it encrypted, all of those good things, and do we even need it in the first place?
Yeah. I want to move on. We're going to bring on a panelist in a sec, but I want to move on to Brexit and post-Brexit world we're in. Because obviously we had GDPR, we brought it in the UK, Data Protection Act. We're now out with the EU. So the EU still has GDPR, but we have our version of GDPR. As I understand it, we've got a sort of like breathing period of 6 months where it's like, okay, we'll just pretend for data purposes that we're still with the EU and everything's still fine. Yeah. But what happens when the 6 months runs out?
So at the end of that 6 months, the nirvana, the hope that everybody is wishing and crossing everything, 4 fingers, feet, legs, everything, is that we will be given adequacy. Now, there's a couple of issues around that. I'm.
When you say given adequacy, what is it for the layman like me? What is that?
So adequacy would be the EU telling us that our data regulatory spectrum and space is adequate for the transfer of the data to us, so to and from the European countries. And they've given adequacy to a number of countries already. It's quite a small amount of countries, to be fair. There aren't very many on the adequate statement list. And you can find that on the EU's website. But that's what the nirvana would be that, okay, your stuff is as good as ours, which in theory, at the moment, it is.
Because we're still fairly fresh out of that process. So
we're literally just out of that box. The DPA 2018, if you look at it, it basically is GDPR with a couple of spin-offs for things like law enforcement, intelligence agencies, public bodies, all that kind of stuff, how they must respond and manage the data, because the GDPR doesn't address those points. It says that those are member derogations. They need to look at how they do that. So I often refer to myself as an optimistic pessimist. That way I am never disappointed, but quite often surprised. And my view on it would be that I think, as it stands, there's a lot involved with it, and we may get adequacy. I say may. The issue with that is that we have quite stringent rules around regulatory environment for the use of data by law enforcement and by the intelligence agency, the oversight that goes in with that. Now, the issue with that is the European Courts of Justice have already said that our way of doing things is a bit different from theirs. The European Union is a bloc. So if we start to diverge too much, that's where the issue will come. Now, Boris Johnson has stood up in Parliament and said we will diverge eventually. We will, but we're running a risk here out of Brexit of being that piggy in the middle between two massive blocs that we want to work with.
One being the US, one being the EU.
One being the US, one being the EU. Yeah. And what do we have to do to either ensure the US bit works, and how does that then compare to what works with the? So because the issue you've got is, so for example, Schrems. So if you throw the Schrems equation into that, so the court case in regards to Max Schrems 2,
because his issue was how data is used regarding intelligence agencies. So it
was Facebook. So it was his actual target was Facebook, and it was how Facebook were using standard contract clauses to move data from the European Union to America. So they were storing data in, because the way Facebook's works is that Facebook have a centralized hub for where they store all their data. Well, they did. They don't now, but they did. And everything went to California, and it sat in their data center in California. But they were using standard contract clauses for that, and he had an issue with that, quite rightly so. And as a result of that, Facebook have had to move their model to, they've got European data centers, etc. But it's cost the Irish data regulator a small fortune. I think they've lost something in the region of 10% of their annual operating cost for that year, because they've got to pay Max Schrems' court fees. European Court of Justice found that they didn't do as they should have done, because his major argument was that had they regulated against Facebook, who are hosted in Dublin, which is why it's done through that regulator, they would have solved this problem. He should never have gone to court. And the European Court went, you're right, you're probably right there. So there you are, slap a fine, slap fees on the Irish data regulator. But when you add all of this complex into a mix and the requirement for trade agreements, what does that look like? There's a lot of money in data. There's a lot of business flow in data. So is that going to ebb, flow, go back, and the divergence piece? So we're all. I think the thing is we're all sitting on tenterhooks as to whether we then go and have a brass plaque on a wall in Europe to show that we're appointees. And there was a recent article, I'm trying to remember where I saw it, but there was a recent article where someone has actually said, you probably, to avoid all these complications, I think it was predominantly around the trade piece rather than the data protection piece, but the VAT bit and all that kind of stuff in the new world, that is how that's working. I think the government have turned around and said, you should appoint a shell company, in inverted commas, or a plaque on a wall in Europe somewhere to avoid all of these things. And is that where we're going with data protection, for example? Right.
Interesting. Sounds a bit like a sort of sticking plaster solution. But on that point, I want to bring in our two panelists, if that's doable. We have joining us Steve White, who's the Chief Executive of Privacy Culture, or Privacy Culture. Maybe we should get that right. No, privacy. We also have Simon Newman, who's Head of Cyber and Business Services at Police Crime Prevention Initiatives. Welcome to you both.
Morning.
Simon, I'd want to start with you first, if I can, because we talked about this idea of, Glenn touched on it, privacy by design, and obviously we're used to the crime prevention initiatives being, about privacy by design in things like cars and doors and windows and all that kind of thing. Presumably, there's, thanks partly to GDPR, there's a whole thing now like how you design your computer products and software products to design that in. That seems to be where it's going. And does that help with what Glenn was talking about, where you can sort of say, look, we've put all of this in place ahead of time, so if something goes wrong, you can point to that and say, look, we did try to stop these breaches happening.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, what we want to see, in place are a set of clear standards for organisations to have, if they're producing products or set themselves up in terms of their structure. I mean, one of the areas that's really exciting and interesting at the moment is about the emergence of IoT, Internet of Things. We're seeing a huge increase in the number of products being sold into the UK marketplace. Everything from access control systems, video doorbells, kettles, ovens, even Wi-Fi bathrooms. there's a huge increase in those products, and yet the standards or the quality or the security of those, it's very unclear what's in place. So there's a lot of work going on at the moment, and I guess we're looking at what's happening in the rest of the world. So the US, for example, particularly the state of California, have started bringing in legislation to set a minimum level of standards. In the UK, we've got the DCMS Code of Practice, which mirrors the ETSI standards. So we're getting there, but we're still not quite at that point where I'd say there's a consistent process. And I guess the other issue for me on that is what we need really is government to be probably a lot firmer. I think the government approach in the UK is to say, there's a code of practice. We'd like to set out what those 13 standards are, and we want to sort of encourage businesses and manufacturers in particular to follow those, but we're not going to enforce it. They're talking about legislating for 3 of those principles. Fantastic. But do we actually need to go even further than that now and actually ask them to put in place more rigorous processes?
But isn't the way you do that through people like the ICO turning around to companies and saying, well, look, not only have you had a breach, but the systems that you installed, the software that you installed, the kit that you installed didn't have great privacy settings, and you didn't upgrade them or update them? Isn't the ICO the way that you get that kind of enforcement that you're looking at of the code of practice and the best practice?
Yeah, I think it's at a number of levels. The ICO has a role, absolutely. I think government has a role. I'd even say large organizations who have supply chains with companies that are manufacturing these products as well have an important role. It's about changing the behavior of businesses to make sure that there is actually design or good quality design principles built into whatever they're doing. And I still think we're quite some way off that at the moment.
Interesting stuff. Steve, I want to come to you on this point about Brexit and what's going to happen, because it does strike me that, we had this, I knew what was going to happen. I knew it would get to sort of midnight on the 31st of January and suddenly it's, we've got a deal, because everybody, with this whole 6-month deadline that Glenn's pointed out, the sort of 6-month grace period we've got, surely the suspicion is we'll get to 6 months and we'll fudge it and it'll all be fine after 6 months, right? Tell me.
I hope not, because there's rather a lot of trade that's dependent on that two-way flow of data between us and our neighbours. So I really hope that's not the case. I've never heard the phrase that Glenn quoted, which was great, pessimistic, optimistic, or something like that. I'm a little bit more of an optimist, and I do believe because of that trade necessity, we will see some type of adequacy decision made. There's a lot of pressure on Europe and London, the government, to make sure that gets signed off and it's a done deal. And actually, we talk about it was 4 months with a 2-month extension. So the clock is ticking. My sources at Whitehall tell me that a lot of behind the scenes work is still going on with Brexit or post-Brexit, if you like. So maybe my optimism is a little bit more. I'm still firmly in the camp that we're going to see some type of adequacy decision. It does raise other questions, like making sure that each organisation has the appropriate safeguards, and obviously Glenn referred to the standard contractual clauses and model clauses, which should be in place anyway. So I think if you look at the bigger picture, I think there's a lot of good reason for the EU to approve that adequacy decision.
Yeah. But that's the thing. It's so if we get in 6 months' time, we get the adequacy decision. We're able to just sort of continue as per. How often is that going to be reviewed? So if the UK starts to move away from Europe and do different things, maybe as Glenn's talked about, as piggy in the middle, if we start to move towards the US a bit more than the EU, is it constantly appraised as to whether the UK is still up to snuff regarding our practice?
My understanding is that there are, if you like, formal review periods, periodic review periods, sort of 3, 5, and 10-year review periods. I think it's like any contract, it constantly needs updating, and you need to go back to the drawing board, because the parameters or like, as Glenn alluded to, we might start adopting, or Simon mentioned about adopting more codes of practice. And I just want to actually just emphasize a point there. I think Simon was quite right in saying about the codes of practice being led by business. If we look at other industry sectors, we've like the security industry, we've created our own benchmark, we've created our own level playing field in terms of ISO 27001, etc., etc. So I think there's more work to be done on this. The privacy industry is still quite nascent. I appreciate that we should have all been doing, as Glenn said, incremental changes, not a big bang a couple of years ago. But I do think a lot of organisations didn't fully understand the lawful basis by which they had obtained the information, and what GDPR came along and said, well, hang on a minute, you've got to be darn sure you know what the lawful basis is by which, and you've got to make sure you've got contracts, and you've got to make sure there's adequate security and appropriate so it's that kind of thing, I think, which will be business led and consumer led, and that's the point that I think what we're seeing is the consumers now expect so much more in terms of transparency and privacy standards, and we've seen this in security. I look back fondly with the SSL, the little padlock in the bottom of the your web browser, the good old days, and you wouldn't trust them unless you got that. Well, I think we're going to end up with a privacy type equivalent.
That's interesting. You generally, so I'm always interested in this as to whether the public is going to drive this. Steve, there've been interesting moments where I felt that the public kind of gets it and actually is holding companies to account and saying, no, I'm not going to use your service because of these issues. Do you really think that's bedding in with the public? Do you think there's that groundswell?
Yeah, and I do. I think if you look at all of the research, excuse me, it all points to the increased understanding that we as consumers have. The area which I just wanted to mention, because we're privacy culture, so we're all about embedding a culture of privacy. In fact, the area where there hasn't been any research, which I'm very proud to announce that we've started a research project with Queen Mary University, is on employee attitudes, behaviours, and that should also help, because the more evidence we find about why, and especially as we're all working from home, why do you act differently when it comes to privacy settings or security settings for work, yet you don't apply those same principles at home? And I think this merging between the home environment, where we're all being forced to work from home, is now bringing that to bear.
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the best presentations I did, we did a presentation of Ethical Hacker Friend and I to a law firm. And it was brilliant. They got hundreds of people in the room. And I sort of said, how do you manage to get everybody to turn up? And he said, well, we didn't pitch it as this is how work is going to, this has security at work. We pitched on how to protect your family, how to protect your kids. And people turned up because they were massively interested in that. But of course, all those lessons rolled over into home. Glenn?
Yeah, so I was just going to jump in on that point, and that's very, 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 very true. So the way I do security awareness with my other hat on is I tie it all back to how does it protect you? I'm not interested in, well, I am interested in the business, obviously, and the organisation, but I'm not interested in it as more than, if I can give you good habits that you'll do at home, you'll bring those good habits with you back to the office. And it's all about that. It's that cultural, and it's also understanding the path of least resistance. I mean, Simon will have seen it. There's an excellent photo where someone's installed a barrier across a road, and it's got a big green field on either side of it. And then all you see is the road track marks going round the barrier, because that's the path of least resistance. And that's what people do. People will do the quickest, easiest thing to do to get to where they want to go from point A to point B. And they show it in every physical security presentation you ever go to, especially in government. It's always there. But so we need, as an industry and as an organisation, we need to make sure we're doing that. And to Steve's point earlier about the ISO standard, so there is one out there now, ISO 27701, nice little gobful, which is all about setting up your privacy. It's like an ISMS, so the Information Security Management System, but setting it up for a privacy information security management. So that's coming. It's coming. It's going to take a while for adoption, I think. But then there's one other point I'd like to bring up, which is around, to Simon's point, around the code of conduct. is things like Cyber Essentials. So Cyber Essentials is key in any setting up any functional IT security and privacy type environment, because it sets the basic standard, and it sets the basic standard to which we should all allude. And they've now included what they're calling the IASME governance aspect, which is all about data protection. So you can cross-reference what you're currently doing against what the ICO say you should be doing.
Yeah, Jeff, could I just come in? I just wanted to pick up on a couple of things Steve said, and also what Glenn was mentioning there. I think in terms of public awareness, I would sort of challenge a few things from Steve, and the way I would say that is that I saw a survey recently about young people in particular who have an expectation that they will have their data breached, and it's almost it's expected. Which I find quite terrifying. I've got a 13-year-old daughter, and her attitude is, it's going to happen. I'm at some point, because my life is pretty much always online, I know I'm going to become a victim of a data breach in some way. And we know that roughly 1 in 2 firms now are going to be having at least one cyber attack or a breach in a 12-month period. So it's incredibly common. As for public being more aware and actually demanding that change, I don't think we're quite there yet. And one of the challenges that we often see, and I think you mentioned this quite rightly, I think Glenn made this point, if you talk about cyber awareness or data protection, it switches people off. If you talk about, so I always say, if I run an event on cyber awareness, how to keep your business secure, I might get 30, 40 people through the door pre-COVID times. If I was to run an event about how to make £1 million off Facebook, I'd have people queuing down the door. Now, I'm not saying that's the right thing to do, but we're not very good at articulating the real benefits of why investing in security is good, why keeping data safe is good. And I think we, business, industry, government, and others, need to spend a lot more effort on getting those positive messages out to people, get them better informed, help them encourage them to challenge things. And that's the way you'll change behavior.
But just to pick up on your point, Simon, there, you're right. There are so many data breaches. There's just a constant flow of data breaches. I think Vice or Motherboard had a series running called Another Day, Another Breach, where they just tried to sort of, keep covering these things. If that is the case, but you're simultaneously trying to say to people, privacy is very important, but we're constantly saying, well, privacy's been breached all over the place. That's quite a bleak message, isn't it, Simon, for people? I don't know how
it is.
those things.
Yeah, and I always say one of the difficulties I have is if I was to talk about physical crime, so burglary, car theft, assault, you can describe it, you can imagine what it looks like. If you talk about cybercrime or data theft, well, so what? It's really hard. And when I talk to people who've been victims of those types of incidents where they've lost data, you say, well, what consequences have you faced? And some of them, well, I've just been told I've lost my data, but I haven't seen a consequence of that. If I have, and I've lost money from my bank account, and then the banks may well have reimbursed me. So there's almost a very laissez-faire attitude by members of the public around cybersecurity and data protection. And just an example, you mentioned teissTalk earlier, and that's a cracking case. £400,000 fine pre-GDPR, but actually what that resulted in was a £77 million cost to teissTalk and the loss of 101,000 customers. But they came back. Dixon's 9% drop in their share price, but again within a matter of days back up to normal. So we have a very short-term memory in terms of these incidents, and I think that's a real concern.
Yeah. And Ben, I want to come to you quickly just on the just picking up back on the Grindr thing. One of the things we didn't mention was this is the Norwegian Data Protection Authority. You've implemented this, and obviously Norway's not part of the EU, and I found that quite interesting. And we reflected back on the Marriott thing, the Marriott breach, and again in the Marriott case, the ICO were acting on behalf of data regulators around Europe, which presumably this won't do again now. But we've got this position potentially where there's now in the UK, there's the UK's ICO, there's the EU data protection authorities, whatever it is in the US, you might have to fill me in on that. But, companies face it from multiple directions.
So to answer the question around the US, it's each individual state, and their rules and regulations about reporting and how they do that are absolutely ridiculous. Every single one's different. Right. Whether that changes under Joe Biden, I don't know. I have seen mooted recently stuff about a federal piece of legislation coming out. But again, how do you enforce that in a federal environment other than using a federal regulator? But even and looking at Facebook's interaction with their federal regulator, it's very, very similar to BA's with the ICO. They to and fro, they to and fro, they to and fro. I think to your point, there will be that double layer And it will have to come, because the European Union will do what the European Union needs to do to protect its citizens as they see it in the bloc. And the Norway one's interesting because as you rightly said, Norway are not part of the EU, but they are part of the economic area, which is the GDPR applies as well. Right, so that's why that was able to be implemented the way it has been. And you do see it where you see lead agencies taking the role on things. Schrems, so that was Facebook was through Dublin. Google, there's been a big push against Google in France. And then and that's slowly but surely turning into a global thing. I mean, just look what's happening in Australia at the moment, where Google talking about pulling out of Australia. So I think you will see that dual layer. Whether our regulator works in hand with the European regulators to work together to get to where we want to be as an environment, I think there'll be more of that. So I don't think, as long as we have an adequacy statement, there'll still be work with the working groups in Europe, or that we stay aligned, all of that kind of stuff. And then if something is hosted in the UK, then maybe they'll come to the ICO regulator and say, can you deal with this rather than we deal with it, because you can do it internally in the UK, and the rules and regulations are still the same, or should be, hopefully. And the fining and all that kind of stuff will stay the same. But it was interesting to see that they've just brought out a new regulation, and I was about to allude to it, and it's completely gone out of my head. So Steve, what it is now.
I just wanted just to pick up on your point there, I think, Glenn, which is quite right. We are seeing individual nation states still with their individual regulators on top of the European Data Protection Board, which is the supervisory regulator, if you like, the mothership for Europe anyway. But if you look at the analysis, or if you do any type of analysis on the types of fines and the nature of those fines, there's a couple of common themes which come through. The first thing I just want to point out is that the UK, despite the bashings that we give our regulator, the ICO, is in the top 3 of the European individual states, number of fines issued, and they don't make the press every day. So there's a few £1,000s here, there's £10,000 there. But the Italian Garanti, for example, have just last week almost subpoenaed TikTok, because they're saying, you can't continue to process data unless you can validate their age. So this, what the point here is, and there is an issue around laissez-faire, as Simon said, as sort of attitudes. But the point is, there is a lot of work going on, and we're still rather nascent. We're still opening up our minds and concepts to have IoT fridges and things like that, and self-driving cars. So we're racing in terms of that innovation, and if you like, the regulators are struggling to keep up. But I do believe, and maybe this is that optimism coming through, that the public will drive this through, and industry will drive this through. It'll become a necessity to be able to demonstrate the value not only to your shareholders, about how you respect people's data rights, how you respect their information. And I think what we'll see is a lot of good stuff coming out. And one of the key findings in all of the analysis, and there's been hundreds of fines applied across Europe in the last couple of years, is around 2 things. The first is security. So Article 32 talks about appropriate, adequate security controls, etc., and making sure that they're in place and tested. And we've heard about Cyber Essentials, which is a fantastic kite mark. And the other is around training. And so what we've got to do as organizations in our roles as CISOs or DPOs is we've got to keep we've got to keep at it. We've got to keep communicating, keep educating, and that in turn will help those young people, because my sons, I agree with Simon's sentiment. They're a bit sort of like, well, it's a done deal, isn't it? It's going to happen. I do agree with that. But we have a responsibility, and organizations and businesses have a responsibility to say, no, that's not good enough. We've got to protect, the data. We've got to protect the rights of the individual. And I think this is where Europe and fundamentally GDPR is having a massive impact. I work with organizations in Singapore, in Jakarta, Joburg, and India. And if you look at the new legislation and regulation that they're putting in place, they're all based, and Brazil, they're all based on GDPR. So we are seeing a contagion effect, and that's what needs to happen, and that is what's happening. But please just bear in mind, we're only a couple of years in, so we're still very nascent.
Indeed, Steve, thanks for that. I think that was a great sort of point to wrap up on. I like the idea of GDPR being the sort of rising tide that's raising all the boats up. Let's hope for that future. We had a question that came in from David James. Apologies, David, we've run out of time to answer your question, but it was a really interesting one. With more and more companies moving to cloud-based technology, the use of cloud-based databases, who's responsible for the security of that data? And in case of a data breach, who would be liable? David, I think that's possibly the topic for an entire new teissTalk, which we can talk about. But I want to thank our panel. Thanks so much for joining us. Glenn Heimers of Save the Children, Steve Wright of Privacy Culture, and Simon Newman of Police Crime Prevention Initiatives. Thank you for joining us. Fascinating discussion on GDPR on World Data Privacy Day. Folks, as I say, we are here live every Thursday at 10 o'clock, every Tuesday at 4. Stick us in your diary. Take a few minutes out of your day just to join us for our chats, covering all the bases: diversity in hiring, AI. We will be returning to that issue that David raised of data protection and the cloud, no doubt at some point soon. Have a great rest of the day. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you again soon. Cheers.
Thank you.
Thank you all.